So 2 months after receiving glowing reviews on my performance check-in and after 3 years of good performance reviews, suddenly I was failing everything and they walked me out of the Coeur d'Alene office. It happens and it's real. I'm here to tell you it's real. There is a playbook that FBI management can use that if they want to get you, they will. Initially, they sent me to West Virginia and hit me with a loss of effectiveness transfer, accusing me of everything under the sun, from not being able to work with women, to being a liar, to being toxic, to ruining the relationships with all of my partners in North Idaho to the point that no one would work with the FBI anymore because of me. And the only resolution was to send me somewhere else.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Game Crimes with Murph in the Morning. What is wrong with you people that you keep coming back here? You know, I'm a redneck hillbilly, but I guess you like the guests I bring on. That's what it is. I know that's what it is. But welcome back. It means the world to me that you do come back. I hope you're enjoying what you see. I hope you joined us yesterday to hear part one of the interview with Zach Schoffstall. We're going to get into the meat and potatoes, why I really brought him on the show. You can tell if you saw yesterday's episode, he's a little bashful. I've been having to pull teeth to get him to talk, which is the best guest to have, because if I got to sit there and ask him questions, you're not here to listen to me. You can go do that on Patreon. You're here to meet our guests. So, Zach, I really appreciate you being so open and transparent with your stories. And what we're getting ready to get into now is, I think you're going to agree with me after you listen to this episode. This is just unbelievable that things go on within our government where politics plays such a pivotal role. You folks have been with me for a while. I try to stay apolitical here on the regular podcast, but this is one where we might have to get a little political just because of what happened is wrong. So as we left it yesterday, Zach had just left the training academy, the FBI training academy in Quantico, Virginia, had been selected for a supervisory position in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which he's from Montana. I guess that's drivable. I haven't been to either one of those states yet, but at least you're close to home, right?
We're going to have to fix that, Murph.
I'd love to visit Montana one of these days.
Sharps, obviously. I mean,
that would be cool. That would be very cool.
We'll make this happen.
And now I know a guy.
I know a guy. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And what Zach's talking about is his business now. He took over a business that his dad started where they actually make Sharps rifles. If you don't know what those Sharps is, go look it up. It's a part of our history in the founding of the United States. You need to know what that is. So do some homework there. I'm giving you a homework assignment. Go find out what a Sharps is, and you'll find out more about Zach here. So, Zach, you pull into Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. You got your permanent bride with you now, not your practice wife. Have your kids been born yet?
My daughter's been born. My son is ultimately born here in Coeur d'Alene, born at the hospital here in Kootenai County.
All right. I don't even know where Coeur d'Alene is, other than it's in the state of Idaho. Is that in the middle, north, south, east, west? Where is it?
It's way up in the panhandle. Idaho's got a panhandle, kind of like the panhandle of Florida, except it's vertical, not horizontal. I'm 2 hours from the Canadian border. So to say that I'm up there. Elevation is not that high, 3,400 feet or something like that. Certainly not as high as it was in Montana where I grew up, but we're pretty far north.
Yeah.
It is very close to Spokane, Washington, actually referred to as Spokane, which was the meth capital of the country for a long time.
Straight out of Spokompton.
Straight out of Spokompton. So the panhandle's not super wide. So yes, I'm within an hour of driving to Montana, and I'm within 20 minutes of being in Washington.
And so how many people you got assigned to your office, gun toters?
Sure. So I was responsible for the northern half of Idaho, which is 10 counties up through the panhandle. We had two offices. We had the Coeur d'Alene office and an office in Lewiston. And depending on the day, I had 7 to 8 agents, toters, split between the two offices, and then kind of a handful of support staff, a couple of intelligence professionals. I had a secretary, which the Bureau doesn't call them that anymore, but she's a great administrative specialist, victim specialist, in the office. So it's a criminal heavy office out here, as is a lot of our resident agencies. You've got Indian reservations out here, which for your listeners that don't know, Indian reservations are federal territories. They are still recognized. Those that are under treaty with the federal government are still recognized as a conceptual sovereign nation. Now, it's not the same as like Mexico versus the United States or Canada versus the United States, but they do have some interesting rights given to them because of the treaties that they signed in the 1800s. So the three Indian reservations that were in my AOR was the Nez Perce near Lewiston, Idaho, the Coeur d'Alene near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then the Kootenai tribe, which is pretty small, The vast majority of the Kootenai tribe is up in Canada, and they are up near Bonner's Ferry. There's a small reservation up there. Arguably, if it weren't for the Indian reservations, there would be less of an argument to have FBI personnel out here. But again, so they're federal territories. What does that mean? That means, in the general sense, that the state and county law enforcement officers don't have jurisdiction over crimes committed by an Indian within the boundaries of the reservation. So it's either going to fall to their own police department, Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the FBI. And out here, we don't have Bureau of Indian Affairs other than there is one Bureau of Indian Affairs drug agent, which BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, is kind of split into two, general crimes and drug crimes. That was a big chunk of what we did, but then we still had agents that also did white-collar crimes, public corruption investigations, terrorism investigations. At this point in time was mostly domestic terrorism investigations. And when I first got here, we had a violent crime task force that was doing some pretty low-level drug investigations. That's most of what it is. Occasionally, you'd have something else pop up. You'd have a fugitive come through. You'd have maybe some kind of Hobbs Act robbery or a bank robbery. North Idaho is not an overly populated area. It is next to Spokompton. So if Spokompton is, I think, 600,000 people or 500,000 for that metro area on the Idaho side, it's a couple 100,000. So again, it doesn't merit significant FBI resources, but we're here, and you're just trying to provide a service to the community.
The Indian tribe thing is really interesting. I had a guest on here who's become a good friend, Earl Cohen. He was episode 168, and he grew up in Orlando, as a matter of fact, where I live, and went to the University of Central Florida. But he is now the chief of the Swinomish Indian tribe, the tribal police out there, and he's a white guy. He actually had Javier and I come out and we spoke. We did our little Escobar thing for everybody out there, all the local police agencies. Beautiful area in upstate Washington. But I found it very interesting. One of my questions was, how do the Indian tribal people take to a white guy coming in and enforcing the law and telling them what they can and can't do? And I was surprised by his responses. It's a great episode, but I understand what the challenge is there on the Indian reservations for you guys. How much drugs and violence were you seeing in your area of responsibility out there?
Mix. Unlike my time in Virginia, where coke was king, meth out here, I'd get excited when one of my agents would bring to me a story or intel that there would be coke coming through. Finally, a real drug that we could talk about. Deal with all this meth and pills and counterfeit this and that. I'm like, give me some good old-fashioned powder. Yeah. Well, it really get me excited. Somebody's going to start about whipping it up into crack. So now, predominantly the drug of choice out here is meth. There was some heroin that would come through. Obviously, now you've got fentanyl in just about everything, unfortunately. You're very familiar with that. Yeah. So the mess would come through, you'd have the pill presses and stuff would come through. In central Washington and the Tri-Cities in particular, you've got a very significant Mexican mafia presence. So the supply chain from Mexico is real strong going into the Tri-Cities, and it would branch out from there.
What are the Tri-Cities that you're talking about?
Yeah, so Tri-Cities is south central Washington, and it's Richland, Pasco, Kennewick. That's where the Hanford nuclear plant is. Richland, is an old government town. The Corps of Engineers built it to service the Hanford nuclear plant during World War II. Either Fat Man or Little Boy came out of that nuclear reactor. So it's a lot of agriculture. It's right on the Columbia River, and I don't know the exact history other than there's a significant migrant worker population and history of that going out to service all of the agriculture that's there. You ended up with a very strong drug supply line. My time here, it was mostly, again, a little bit of heroin, a lot of meth, and then when fentanyl started getting laced into everything, it was everything coming up. Yeah. But you've got cities like Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston they're not source cities. Right? Neither was Richmond. Richmond wasn't a source city either, right? Like source cities or major distribution hubs would be New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, Dallas, Texas. So for the Northwest, Tri-Cities falls into that. And then it would fan out from there. It'd come over to Spokane, or it'd come directly over to Lewiston. So in and out of the Indian reservations, the violent crime and the peripheral drug crime was really all the same. You had distribution quantities, but lower levels. We weren't talking about kilos or, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds. If somebody did a car stop that had 20 or 40 pounds of meth in it, that was a big deal around here. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that was a transitory stop. Idaho State Police had interdiction teams that would run Interstate 90, which runs through the Panhandle, runs through Coeur d'Alene. You've seen these. Like interdiction teams can stop a lot of dope coming through. Yeah. And again, it's just transiting the area. Maybe it would stop for a lower level distribution, but it's a transit stop. So it's either going north into Canada, which years ago, drugs used to come down from Canada into the U.S. Now a lot of it is the pipeline from Mexico goes through the United States and up into Canada through ports of entry. And we have two ports of entry here in North Idaho.
Our guest last week was Brent Cartwright, who was a police officer in Kansas City, Missouri. He worked undercover for years and years, and it was street level stuff. And he ultimately was shot 6 times by an AR-15 by a guy wanted for murder, ended him his career. He's making the best of it now, doing a great job. But one of the things that we talked about last week was the fact that, and I'm asking you this to see if you would concur, have you seen that the smaller the drug violator, the more violence he's prone to?
I saw that in Richmond. I definitively saw that in Richmond, with the lowest guys on the totem pole in gangs and in drug trafficking organizations were the guys that were putting in the real work. And when I say work, like violent work.
Yeah.
In Idaho, the guys that were doing most violence were users. Maybe they'd be a low-level distributor for within their given, I use the term loosely, friend group. Yeah, I mean, the folks that are on the higher end of that supply, at least in the areas that I work, violence was typically not great for business.
Right.
And if you were moving significant weight, it was a business for you.
Yep.
In the street gangs of Virginia and the Bloods and stuff like that, it'd be a little bit different because a lot of times you'd have some turf wars and violence could be, you needed to assert themselves, or outside of beat-ins to get into the gang, there could be assaults and robberies and rapes and stuff to get into the gang. Out here, you don't have, at least in Idaho, you don't have a significant gang presence, but the violence that you see, most of which, to be quite honest, out here is domestic violence. Somebody's drunk or high, they beat on a girl, or they beat on each other, or they sexually assaulted a child. Like, that's the stuff that we would see a lot. In the Indian reservations, then my wife was a prosecuting attorney in Virginia and then a prosecuting attorney here in Idaho. A lot of places would call it a DA, a district attorney. That's just not the right term for here, but it's the same job. She'd be prosecuting the same stuff. Low to medium level drug possession or distribution. Idaho is not a state that really has a conspiracy charge at the state level. And then a lot of the violent crime was generally domestic in nature, between domestic partners, between friends, and then a lot of sexual assaults. And those would usually, not always, but usually involve some type of drug and or alcohol use. When you involve children, that was sometimes the case, but not always. We saw on the reservation, and then she saw out in the regular community, significant sexual predator crimes for kids. But a lot of that stuff, to be quite honest for your listeners, isn't strangers. The vast majority of sexual crimes towards children is a trusted family member or a trusted associate. So a school teacher, priest, the neighbor that's always at the house, or one of my wife's big jury trials was a father groomed and sexually assaulted all of his children in prepubescent years.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
For about a decade each.
Man, you talk about perverted environments. Holy cow. Now, when did you get to Coeur d'Alene? What year was it?
2019. So I was here in 2019 and then worked it 3+ years. And then the train came off the tracks in 2020.
Well, let's see. So the Biden administration comes in and you guys start getting directives from your headquarters. And you talked yesterday about how the Bureau is kind of centric to the headquarters as this has developed over the years, directing what the field should do, right? And I think that's probably true for most federal law enforcement agencies, but it seems like the Bureau really, I mean, it's almost like they put handcuffs on you investigators in the field to tell you, don't worry about that. This is your focus now. Was that a fair statement to say?
I mean, we could spend hours talking about that topic. As much as I flew the Bureau flag really high, and I was very proud to be an FBI agent, and I worked really hard, those of us that were in the field trying to get work done, it was to a degree, trying to be successful in spite of the Bureau. The Bureau added policy by the bucket loads, sometimes bucket loads by the day. And when I came in 2008 and 9, it was post 9/11, and it was still everything international terrorism, right? Radical Islamic terrorism. And it was, you better find it. And I had times where my first case on the JTTF, I got handed phone numbers that were 8 parts removed from a suspected terrorist. And it was, get a case up on them, and then we want FISA. And it was all the pressure coming down from headquarters, coming down from Capitol Hill. The Bureau's in the cycle of going to Capitol Hill and asking for more funding and trying to justify it with numbers. The Bureau is absolutely horrible about trying to quantify everything. Everything's got to be quantifiable.
Yeah.
It's not qualitative. You just lose it. You lose the message, you lose the impact. But what took premise was stats that meant didn't mean shit to anybody. It no longer was how many indictments did you do, how many criminal complaints did you get, how many search warrants did you execute. Instead, it was other numbers, disruptions and dismantlements and a bunch of other gobbledygook.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but you mentioned FISA. Can you just explain that real quick?
Yeah, FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. In all cases, you are expected to, by law, pursue the least intrusive technique available to you to gather the evidence you need to determine criminal conduct and present it in the courts.
Very well said.
Well, on the criminal side, what is available to you are subpoenas, either an administrative subpoena or a grand jury subpoena. What subpoenas will get you would be like basic toll records. So like if you're trying to determine if person A is a drug dealer, you've got information that they are coming from an informant or a debrief of somebody. A subpoena just needs to really be in furtherance of your predicated investigation. And you can go and ask for person A, called person A, B, C, D, E, and F. So toll records from your phone company, and then also subscriber records. The same thing to some degree with financial records. You can get those with a subpoena. But you can't get content of anything with a subpoena. That would require a search warrant for content. Or if you're trying to get live content, that would be a Title III wiretap, like we talked about earlier. Reasons that you might use the FISA is if you have classified information in your case, or in the Bureau's case, the international terrorism investigation is classified simply because it is an international terrorism investigation. There's a whole other talk about the FBI overclassifying everything. But you can't take classified information to the grand jury. You can't take classified information to a judge. You'd have to go through a declassification process first. You're not likely to do that if you're in the midst of an investigation. So the federal government created the FISA courts. So the FISA courts are judges, security clearances, and you would present, like you would in a criminal court, you would present affidavits in furtherance of whatever you're asking for. So search warrants, pen register, trap and trace, Title III wiretaps. They just don't call it a Title III wiretap. They would call it a FISA. FISA is just kind of an all-encompassing term for anything that you would get from that court, which again would be probable cause statement-based requests for authorization, request to search something, search a physical residence, search an electronic something. Trap and trace data would be live exchanges of information between phone A and phone whatever they're calling, and then live intercepts. There's some other nuanced differences there where there's not a FISA court in every judicial district in the country, so a lot of it is done remotely. So that's the FISA court in a nutshell, and when you're working international terrorism or counterintelligence in the FBI, FISA court's generally where it's at. Domestic terrorism is still under, they're not classified cases on their face, and they are allowed access to the criminal courts to seek normal grand jury subpoenas, search warrants from a normal federal magistrate or district judge, et cetera.
Yeah. And thanks for explaining that. I know it's kind of a long explanation, but it's important because that's what goes on in our country, and that's how classified things get done. You know, you mentioned that some judges are authorized to address FISA issues. You'd kind of think that they all were, but that's how protective we are of what goes on under the FISA umbrella. So when people like a jackass Snowden came along and disclosed a lot of classified information, those were programs that were extremely beneficial to the protection of our country. And the accusations that Big Brother's watching you and there's no oversight, that's all BS. He portrayed it completely wrong. And I hope that nobody ever pardons his happy ass, and hope he dies over in Russia is what I'd prefer, but it's just Murph's opinion. So now you're out there and so we got the new president's in position, Joe Biden. Start getting directives from your headquarters that domestic terrorism and hate crimes is going to become a priority, which I'm fine with.
Yeah, who wouldn't be? I mean, within constraints, the domestic terrorism flavor of the day had honestly started to percolate up as a priority for the Bureau under the Obama administration. Didn't really change significantly from the Bureau's perspective during the Trump administration, even though you had folks like Jeff Sessions as the AG, were crime, which I don't agree with either. Let's find criminals and let's put them in prison. Like, that's the whole point of what we do. So when Biden came into office, he just came in on the heels of this continued push for you have to find domestic terrorism. Soon after that, Attorney General Merrick Garland came out and said that white nationalism and white supremacy was the greatest threat to the country. You had that message generally echoed by FBI Director Wray, and you got folks like myself at the bottom end of that totem pole, if you will, feeling all the pressure of you have to find it. And a place like North Idaho has a complicated history. You've got Ruby Ridge was here. You've got the Aryan Nations compound was here. Both cases are linked, but they also both go back to kind of an anti-government extremism mentality or an allegation thereof, and white supremacy or white nationalism mentality or allegation thereof. So there's a lot of pressure on me and on my team to find domestic terrorism. But at the same time, there's no domestic terrorism acts. Like, there's no violent crime happening here. I'm not getting a bunch of... back in the day with the Aryan Nations compound and The Order, which is a movie that recently came out with another amazing former FBI agent, Wayne Maness, and Tommy Norris working that case. They were not focused on the Aryan Nations compound because they're a bunch of white nationalists, which many of them were, offshoot of those guys that were trying to raise money, collect arms for a race war, but they were knocking off armored cars. Like, they were doing legitimate Hobbs Act robberies, bank robberies, violent crime, killing people, and that's what the Bureau took notice of, and that's what they targeted. When you don't have those crimes, then you're just trying to react to the pressure coming from headquarters of, well, it has to be there. You're in North Idaho. You have to find it. And I think that's just contextual for your listeners to understand that you swear an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, but you also have to answer to lawful orders of your superiors. And you've got all this policy in between coming out of DOJ, coming out of the FBI that you have to abide by. You don't just get to willy-nilly saying, no, I'm not going to look for that. Is it legal for me to go look for X, Y, or Z? If it is, then I'll do it. If it isn't, then I'm not going to do it. You also are not going to work in a place like the FBI and have folks that are placing that pressure on you that are going to openly tell you to do something that's illegal until it gets real extreme. And we could talk about that real extreme instance.
Yeah, we're going to.
Yes, we are.
So you've got this mandate now to address hate crimes, and you actually go find a couple of instances, right?
I did. I mean, there were a couple of, again, just violent incidents we had that, I heard of from the local sheriff's office or the police department or the prosecutor's office. My wife working in the prosecutor's office, I had a pretty solid relationship there and knew what was going on. I mean, you had a white male at the local rest area, just a knife, and lunged at and swung it at a black male. I think his family used a racial epitaph as he was doing it. So, I mean, just basic assault. The evidence would indicate that he's doing it with race as his motivating factor, because he's yelling the N-word at this person and a bunch of other racial epithets while he's swinging away. Fortunately, the guy is able to matrix his way away from the blade and not be cut up by it. And the guy walks away, but he stays until a sheriff's deputy or two shows up and then ultimately takes him into custody. I presented that to the U.S. Attorney's Office, didn't get any indication that they wanted to prosecute it, so it stayed with the state, and Kootenai County ultimately convicted him for this Idaho State's version of a hate crime. And then there was another one, an allegation where a Hispanic male was beat up and assaulted after the bars closed in Coeur d'Alene, and again was called a bunch of racial epithets in the process of beating him up. I brought that to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and again, didn't get any takers. So again, the county pressed forward with those charges. We only have so much time on this podcast, but several problems were presented to me before taking the supervisory position here in Coeur d'Alene, and the lack of prosecutorial vigor out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Idaho, and in particular the Coeur d'Alene office, was brought to my attention before I got here. So getting we're not really interested wasn't my first rodeo on that conversation, but I was doing my due diligence to press it, and I knew the county was going to prosecute him. The Kootenai County Prosecutor's Office has got a great reputation for aggression. They'll take a turd and march it right down the football field, and if it's got convictable evidence, more often than not, they're going to get a conviction. I put my weight behind some sexual assault cases off the Indian reservations that didn't always bear any fruit, which really pissed me off. You don't have a county that can take it because the tribe really can't do much with it. And when you've got children being sexually assaulted by adults, I don't care that it's in the same family, that needs to be prosecuted by the federal government because we're the only ones in town given the treaties. So getting back to the hate crime issue, if there's evidence of it, one, you can't make it up. If it happens, and if you got evidence that supports that it's a violation of federal law under the hate crime statute, then we can consider marching forward. When I met with Josh Hurwitz when he first became the U.S. attorney in summer of 2022, I brought those two instances up, and he just kind of shrugged and said that he was a bit more interested in having conferences than he was about those two cases.
Well, it's hard to lose a conference, but you run a chance of losing a criminal case, right?
And that's just it. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Idaho, many does not like to lose a case. The one case that I had heard of that had gone to a jury trial up here in Coeur d'Alene that was lost, that AUSA was put on a performance improvement plan and just got hammered for it. That does not build a culture. Plenty of people right now in the news are talking about the culture in the FBI, and you and I can talk about the problems in FBI culture. The U.S. Attorney's Office have got some culture issues that they need to be looked at as well.
Absolutely.
Because there are gatekeepers. The FBI,
Yep.
DEA, ATF, you name the acronym that's in the criminal investigative world.
Yep.
You don't get anywhere without the assistance of the U.S. Attorney's Office and without the go-ahead to take it into court. So if you have U.S. Attorney's offices across the country, regardless of whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican appointed U.S. attorney, if their culture is not swing away, then inevitably you're going to get a bunch of cases that could go to court, got guys and gals that committed real criminal conduct that don't go to prison for it because they're just not prosecuted by the U.S. attorney.
Right. Absolutely. Believe me, well, you know as well as I do, it's not solely in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
No, it is most definitely not.
On June 11th, 2022, now this is a day etched in your memory for the rest of
Lives
your
in
life,
infamy.
I'm sure.
Lives on in infamy. Yeah.
And this is during what's called the Pride in the Park event there. Can you tell us what's going on there and what eventually happens?
Sure. All right. So there was a June 11th, there was a pre-plan before COVID. I think it had been kind of an annual Pride in the Park event, LGBTQ event, perfectly legal. They get permits for the park on the lake, and just like any other public event, they have a public event. In this case, coming off of the Black Lives Matter protests and the North Idaho response to that of taking your guns for a walk in downtown Coeur d'Alene, you had a counter political group that was not supportive of the LGBTQ movement. And there'd been some open rhetoric back and forth on social media and in media interviews about this group on the right side of the political spectrum, if you will, saying that they weren't going to stand for this LGBTQ movement and that it was debauchery, whatever terms they wanted to associate with it. Again, it was their terms, their right to say it. They were saying some inflammatory stuff like if they want a war, let them have it here now or let it be here. And then you'd have some, less so, but you'd have some response from the pro-LGBTQ group saying, oh, well, drag queens can bring their guns to town too. So we had generalized information that we were sharing, we, the FBI, were sharing with Kootenai County Sheriff's Office, Coeur d'Alene Police Department, Idaho State Police, all the things that we would do and the public would expect us to do. Coeur d'Alene Police Department had a command post the day of the event just because of all that was going on. They asked me to be in it. I was. I didn't have any of my agents out working that day because we didn't have any specific threat. But you had a tense day in Coeur d'Alene. You had a lot of folks openly carrying guns lawfully in downtown Coeur d'Alene. You had a counter group. You had the LGBTQ group. It wasn't clear all the time who was who. When you see somebody walking around with an AR-15 across their chest. Had the Coeur d'Alene Police Department in possession of information from a West Coast Police Department that there was 20 or 25 or something to that effect, Antifa members in town ready to go to war if things got feisty. There's nothing scarier in North Idaho than Antifa coming to town and having scorched earth policy. So a 911 call came in that there was 20 or so individuals getting in the back of a U-Haul box truck, and they were carrying poles, and they had face masks on, and they were looking like a little army. Well, the PD went into action, found a U-Haul truck, pulled it over, and pulled out 31 individuals with flagpoles and some homemade shields, all wearing khaki and blue shirts and little white face gaiters and baseball caps out of that truck. And we watched it on the Twitter feed of a suspected Antifa member from the command post. And we watched, all kind of scratching their heads as to what was happening. Realized it wasn't likely to be Antifa, right, because it's the wrong colors. And it turned out it was a group called the Patriot Front, which is a white nationalist kind of group that is known to protest around the country a dozen or more times a year. They'd never come to Coeur d'Alene before, but they had their same accoutrement. They're known to travel around in box trucks for that. They're a bunch of idiots. Being an idiot isn't against federal law.
Or state law.
Well, I mean, the police chief took what I would consider a police response, which was, I don't know who these guys are, but everybody's going to jail today.
Yeah.
So he charged them with a misdemeanor crime of conspiracy to riot, which is underneath their disturbing the peace statutes. In other words, it's like conspiracy to disturb the peace. And they all got hooked up and they all went to jail for a couple hours, and then they all came out and they all went back downtown and handed out pamphlets and so forth. Well, that made national news for those that remember that. If not, you can get on the internet and you can look it up. Plenty of images of those guys on their knees being handcuffed by the sheriff's office or the police department. Well, that drew the attention of the U.S. Attorney's Office. There was an assistant U.S. attorney that was at the Pride event, in support of the Pride event. She had a child going through transition, all of which is fine. But she's in one of the individuals that pressed for action against this group that was arrested. Initially, the U.S. Attorney's Office wanted to find federal charges for these guys. And then it quickly became evident that there wasn't anything to federally charge them with. But they weren't deterred. The U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ wanted to do something to what would appear, and again, this is my personal opinion, it would appear that from the facts of what I saw, they wanted to plant the flag that they were doing something about Merrick Garland's number one threat priority. So I did my updates to headquarters over the next couple of days, and I quickly learned from FBI headquarters that this group was well known to be a peaceful protest group, that they'd been looked at numerous times by the FBI, used numerous investigative techniques, and this group did not commit acts of violence. And in fact, they would throw people out of their group for committing acts of violence or discussing acts of violence or wanting to be more aggressive. So there was nothing evidentiary-wise to indicate that this group was going to do something different than what it had done in every other protest that it had gone to.
They have no history of violence.
No. Now, some people would say, well, this group grew out of one of the groups that was at Charlottesville. Okay, the founder of this group was at the Charlottesville event, the Unite the Right event, but he was not charged with anything. And again, you can't be guilty by association in the eyes of federal law enforcement. And that is where things really started to come apart with the advocacy by DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office of trying to paint these guys as right-wing violent extremists, and my agents and my team saying that the facts don't support that argument. So again, you can't be guilty by association, which the initial association was this group was like any other right-wing extremist group. They're violent, just like they were on January 6th. And they wanted to compare this group to January 6th. But none of these individuals were suspected of being at the Capitol on January 6th. And the group wasn't in Washington, D.C. protesting on January 6th. Like that. This group protested stuff like satanic temples, Black Lives Matter, Occupy ICE events, and then obviously gay pride events. So again, is it against federal law to be in a satanic group? No, it is not, as long as you're not advocating for violations of law. But if you want to protest that group, you could do that too, as long as you do it peacefully. And if these guys have a track record of doing it peacefully over and over and over again, then, what's the evidence? There was no violence in Coeur d'Alene, so what's the evidence that it's different this go around? So there was disagreement between the FBI and DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office initially. The U.S. Attorney's Office balked pretty hard at that and said that they were the ones leading the investigation, and that they were going to be the ones to write an affidavit, and then they would determine if there was probable cause. And they just had to have my agents review it and swear it out. I'm sure, Murph, you are well aware that it's not a term you'd ever want to hear come out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, that they're leading an investigation. They have no statutory authority to lead an investigation.
Right.
But they were putting their foot down pretty hard here. My front office, in their stellar lack of leadership, pretty much just said, Zach, figure out a way to work it out. So they wrote a search warrant. My agents reviewed it. My agents were not willing to attest to it and did not feel like it was factually accurate. Again, it had pictures of January 6th in it. These guys weren't there. They wanted to ballpark say that this was just another violent right-wing extremist group, but there's no history of violence. They wanted to say that, well, there was violence at Charlottesville at Unite the Right, and this group came out of that. But none of the individuals in this group were charged. The one individual at Unite the Right that was charged with murder murdered somebody, and he went to prison for it as an individual, rightly so. So my agents weren't willing to swear it out, and that's when I tried to get between my agents and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I tried to get my FBI front office to have my back, and instead of having my back, they walked away. Got some mixed signals. We got email communications from FBI headquarters when they started to become aware that there was this real push coming out of the U.S. Attorney's Office to get this, and my agents weren't willing to swear it out. FBI headquarters, counterterrorism division, said we don't, as an agency, support agents being pressured to swear out warrants, because we've got a bad history of agents being pressured to swear out warrants. And they specifically used the Crossfire Hurricane investigation into the Trump campaign as an example of agents saying that they were pressured to swear out warrants and that there was hell to pay with Congress after the fact. But that didn't deter the U.S. Attorney's Office, didn't deter DOJ, and did not bolster my support with my front office, which was being pushed by the U.S. Attorney's Office that they wanted what they wanted, which was they wanted this warrant. And I think what's important for your listeners to understand is the FBI didn't have a federal investigation here. We had an administrative file to assist the police department. The police department had an investigation for their misdemeanor charges. They executed search warrants on the vehicles associated with these guys, and they were going to execute search warrants for their electronic devices, cell phones, GoPro cameras, and the like. The U.S. Attorney's Office was preventing them from going forward with that state search warrant. I had given the police department language to include in their state search warrant so that the FBI could help them search it. For in a row, we were ready to assist, and if evidence of a federal crime became available to us along the way, then we could open a predicated investigation and we could move forward. But I don't think that was the point. I tried to press that my agents, my front office, 2 weeks after June 11th, that they'd reviewed the U.S. Attorney's Office search warrant, had not found it to be factually accurate. They weren't willing to say that there's probable cause, that this group was going to conspire to riot under the federal riot statute. And I indicated that the front office needed to support them in that, or that the FBI needed to regain some control of this and look at the facts and consider if we should write our own warrant. But that at the end of the day, if a warrant was ever presented to the court after my agents had said that this isn't a good warrant and that they weren't willing to say there's probable cause here, that our obligation is to be transparent with the court. You have to tell the magistrate that if there wasn't a consensus and you had to find somebody else to swear out a warrant because other guys weren't, the magistrate needs to know that. You're trained that. There is no there's no hide and seek from federal magistrates. Unfortunately, that turned out to not be the case with enough political pressure. I was told, no, you will assist the U.S. Attorney's Office while they redraft and wordsmith that warrant. And they did for 2 more weeks. And when a second affidavit was delivered, I told my agents, I had half of my agents in Coeur d'Alene, 2 out of 4 were working that. And I told them both that review it, take your time. If you're comfortable with it, speaks the truth, then we'll open a predicated investigation. You can swear out that warrant and we'll move on. If you're not okay with that warrant, that's okay too. You just got to come and tell me why and we'll all move on. Well, they both ultimately came back on their own and told me that they were not willing to swear out that warrant, that it wasn't a good warrant, that it was not accurate with the facts as they'd known them. They had spoken with other case agents that had looked at this group over the preceding couple of years, that they were aware of what this group and what the individuals in it did to prevent its members from committing acts of violence. And there was no real evidence to support that they were going to do anything violent or anything other than just lawfully protest and give their own opinion in downtown Coeur d'Alene that weekend. And they weren't willing to put their name on a bad warrant. I said, that's not a problem. My front office, that was a problem. And they weren't willing to accept that response from 2 of my 4 agents. And they instead instructed me to find an agent that would be willing to swear it out. Give it to somebody else, see if they'll do it. And I said, no. And I said, you don't take a warrant that 2 agents won't swear out because they say it's a bad warrant, and find somebody that doesn't know anything about it and just says, well, that reads well. Because you and I both know if you had a team of attorneys working on an affidavit for a month, it's probably going to read well.
Right.
But reading well and being an accurate resuscitation of the facts are 2 very different things. You could have a TFO that can't write for anything and doesn't know what a period is, can write an actual affidavit or a factual affidavit that can go before a court. But you can't wordsmith a piece of fiction and present it before a court and swear that it is true and correct to the best of your ability.
Right. So if you happen to do that, and then defense attorneys are going to pursue this vigorously as far as they can, and it's determined that the agent that signed that affidavit, it really wasn't true, he's now got a problem called the Giglio issue, right?
He does.
Which means he can never testify in federal court again. And so how can you be a federal agent if you can't testify in federal court?
Exactly. And under rare instances, perjury is a federal crime. If it's an extreme instance, an agent could find themselves potentially federally prosecuted for perjuring themselves. And as I indicated to Congress and to Director Wray when I started filing my whistleblower complaints, that suborning perjury, pressuring me to get these agents to swear out this affidavit, is also a federal crime. Didn't change things.
So as a result of you doing the right thing, of you living up to your oath, of you standing up for the people that work for you, presenting the facts, not the supposition, to your leadership, which have ultimately made it to FBI headquarters and over to DOJ. What happened to you? They promote you?
Sunshine and roses, buddy. Sunshine and roses. I wish. When I refused to pressure my agents to go back and continue to edit this affidavit until they would come to a yes, or when I refused to find an agent, shop this thing around until somebody was just willing to swear it out, I subsequently got a phone call that this affidavit was on the Attorney General's desk, DAG, Lisa Monaco, and that this was a big deal and that they'd lost confidence in me and lost confidence in my leadership, quote unquote. And I was removed initially from the case, and it was given to another FBI supervisor who I now know had agreed to swear out that warrant herself before she'd ever read it, before she even knew who wrote it. That individual has perjured themselves a lot, as have the assistant U.S. attorneys that pushed this through. Within about a week after I was removed from the case, I took leave and I left town, was headed back home to Montana, and started getting calls from my local partners that they were being interviewed very uncomfortably by my executive management team, and that they referred to it as setups, that I had supposedly ruined everything in North Idaho according to my executive management team, and that they just need to concur with that statement. And the state police and police departments that were communicating with me were not willing to concur with that statement. But it was pretty clear that something was afoot. Even though I had warned my front office numerous times that what they were doing was wrong, I started filing quote unquote official whistleblower complaints to DOJ OIG, ultimately ended up going up to the deputy director and the director, and then into the Congress. But it didn't change the direction of what was happening to me. Within 10 days, I think, of me having the case removed from me, my special agent in charge of Salt Lake Division called me and very angrily told me that I had embarrassed the FBI and embarrassed him, and that he was talking to headquarters about it, and he would cut off any questions that I gave him. And ultimately, I just said I was not trying to be unprofessional, but I wanted him to know that what he was doing was wrong, and that I did not believe what he was doing was in good faith, and that I wanted him to know I'd already filed an official whistleblower complaint for the conduct of his office, the U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ. And his simple response was, well, thanks, Zach, that's your right, and just kind of cast me off. In the coming weeks, I now know that they were referring me to FBI Security Division to have my security clearance pulled. They were referring me to insider threat, consider me an insider threat. They were referring me to Human Resources Division to get me transferred, and they were referring me to Inspection Division to get administrative inspections opened up on me. Ultimately, and against the advice of Human Resources Division, they tried to pursue a loss of effectiveness transfer. So 2 months after receiving glowing reviews on my performance check-in, and after 3 years of good performance reviews, suddenly I was failing everything, and they walked me out of the Coeur d'Alene office. They told me that I was to leave immediately. I was to take my laptops and go home, and not to return. And I was not to speak to my squad. And then within a couple of days of that, I got an email ordering me to West Virginia, on the other side of the country, from my office, my team, my wife, my kids, and my dad, who I was also the caretaker for. So I think for context for your listeners, there's other stories and stuff that are out there about government whistleblowers, FBI whistleblowers. It happens, and it's real. I'm here to tell you it's real. There is a playbook that FBI management can use that if they want to get you, they will. So initially, they sent me to West Virginia and hit me with a loss of effectiveness transfer, accusing me of everything under the sun, from not being able to work with women, to being a liar, to being toxic, to ruining the relationships with all of my partners in North Idaho, to the point that no one would work with the FBI anymore because of me. And the only resolution was to send me somewhere else. I had to reach out to all my partners and just say, hey, I'm being accused of this and that. Free to write up your own thoughts. And subsequently, I sent 37 letters back to Human Resources Division with people writing their own opinions of Zach Schoffstall, whether that was DEA agents I'd worked with, FBI special agents in charge I'd worked for, police departments in North Idaho, sheriff's offices, tribal agencies, child advocacy centers, prosecutorial offices. And one of the most humbling experiences of my life, Murph, you have that many people that on their own are willing to step up and hold the line with you. And that's some pretty powerful stuff. Made me cry lots of times reading those letters. At the same time that my balls are getting kicked in by the FBI, and they're saying something very different. Ultimately, the attempt to transfer me permanently failed, but instead they kept me in limbo for the next year and a half, wouldn't let me return to the Coeur d'Alene office, and ultimately opened up an internal investigation into me and the 2 agents that refused to swear out that warrant. And they used that to fire me, and said that my judgment in not pursuing a more aggressive investigation into this Patriot Front group was wrong and rose to severe misconduct. And there's no room left in the FBI for you. I got that letter via FedEx. It's been a road, Murph. I got to say, for all the fun and all the good people that I met in the FBI, I also got to see how poor our leadership culture is, how thin the ranks are in FBI executive management, and how much political pressure out of DOJ can really swing the needle all the way to the bottom. I wouldn't change anything I did. Could I have maybe pushed harder at the beginning and hoped that maybe I could have gotten the police department to execute their search warrant, and then we would have quickly realized that there was no evidence to support federal riot statute? Then it would have been done. I would like to think it would have been done right there. It would have been dead on arrival. But I couldn't get there. I pushed for that. I didn't get it. Can always wonder, well, could I have just pushed a little bit harder and maybe I could have gotten it done? They punished my agents too, but somewhat minimally. They've tried to place it all on me, which is how I would have it as a leader. I always told my guys their left and right limits, and if they were working between them, I would have their back. And I did. But as my wife said when I got walked out of the office, you fall on your sword for real, it cuts you. And it does. And it did so much. Your identity is wrapped up in being a special agent. It is real cutting. When they isolate you from your family, they isolate you from your team, and then they start hammering you with, you're a horrible person. You're not just a bad agent. You're not just a bad investigator. You're a bad person. You're bad to your core. People won't even be around you. And when you start realizing how far some folks will go and lie, it really upsets the apple cart of your perspective on your organization and on aspects of life. I realized after the fact that during the same week that I'm having meetings with my direct supervisor and all of my criminal investigative supervisory peers about where we're going that year and what priorities we were going to work at. Literally that same week, my supervisor and the other ASACs and the SAC are telling Security Division, Human Resources Division, Insider Threat that I'm such a bad person that under no set of circumstances can I be allowed to remain in the office or come down to Salt Lake City because no one will work with me. At the same time, everybody's in the same room with me, and we're all just trying to figure out how we're prioritizing our resources, what we're going to investigate that year, what are our resource shortfalls, et cetera.
So for showing integrity and living up to your oath, this is what you get.
Unfortunately, at times, but it's true.
It's horrible. I mean, now our listeners will know why I got pissed off when I heard your story. This is outrageous. Here's a man that served his country in the military and then continued to serve in the FBI in a very honorable position, who knows when probable cause exists and when it doesn't. And if you try to push it when it doesn't, that's when you get in trouble, who refused to order his people to lie under oath because they didn't believe in that affidavit. I mean, this is why I try to stay apolitical on the show, because it just ticks you off so bad. But when they do this to somebody who has sacrificed their life, your entire professional career has been to help your country. And this is the thanks you get in the long run. It's outrageous. It's just unfreaking outrageous. Regardless of who you voted for in the recent presidential election, we've got the Trump administration in, and we're seeing changes being made. I don't agree with everything that he does, but the man doesn't call me. None of the presidents have ever called me and asked me my opinion on any decision they made.
That's their loss.
Well, they figure I probably can't count to 10. You got to put a little humor in this because it's just so devastating. You've got 16 years in the Bureau, 4 years in the military. Did they not give you the option to retire with the pension?
But they didn't give me the option of anything. I mean, I had people that were willing to try to protect me without hurting themselves. And that's the difference, right? It's one thing to protect somebody without putting yourself at risk. It's another thing to stand in the breach and take it for the rest of your teammate.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the other whistleblowers, when you're dismissed, I was notified in February of 2024 of my pending dismissal. Human Resources Division chose to put me on paid administrative leave. So even though they took my gun, took my badge, took all my government property, I still received a paycheck until in August, I received the final dismissal letter via email or via FedEx, and then my pay and all the benefits and everything stopped. There was no, other than appeals and all my, court fight, there was no, let's find a softer place. Let's treat this guy differently. But I don't know. I try to stick to the facts, but I will say a personal opinion based on the fact. I stood up pretty hard against the Bureau. I didn't shake my fist. I just said in my appeal letters, in my emails to the director, I said, hey, what's wrong was wrong, and I am who I am, and I will not bend for it. I will stand here to the bitter end. Don't make me do it. And I had the support of my peers. Well, when I was persona non grata to the Salt Lake City Division and I wasn't allowed in a Salt Lake City office, the agents of Salt Lake Division elected me as their FBI Agents Association rep for the division. I mean, if that's not a middle finger to executive management, I don't know what is. But I also think that put the Bureau in a position of they couldn't find a way to let me off because they needed to make it loud and clear that if you really stand up to the machine, this is what's going to. And I think the attitude was fire him, let him sue his way back in. Because that takes years, hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to sue your way back in if you want to get back in at all. So it's been a road, my friend. It's been a road, both professionally, personally. Obviously, my wife and my kids have been through this. My dad passed away 16 days after I received that notification of dismissal. He'd been pretty ill for a number of years. It's been a lot. It's been a heavy burden, but I don't quit on anything. So
yeah, good for you.
I'm still standing.
You're a brother. You're still a brother within the law enforcement culture. And, I still call you brother. A couple of things I want to point out here before we finish up is, and this is the sad part, what happened to those 31 guys on the Patriot Front that were arrested that day? Well, their leader, Thomas Russo, and one other guy, Richard Jessup, charges were dismissed by a judge because it was so screwed up. 7 were convicted of conspiracy to riot. That sounds serious. They're sentenced a few days in jail, a year or two of probation, $1,000 fine when they're not allowed to go back around that park. That's very severe. 20 took plea deals, opting to participating in a parade without a permit, and they paid a fine. 4, including their videographer, have bench warrants out for them because they're on the run. And then there was actually one person on the phone. They found some child porn, and he was convicted and sent to prison. So this is it. I mean, that's it for everything that the Bureau was trying to pursue, and that was the result of the criminal charges, because
here's
there was
the crazy
nothing there to
thing,
start
Murph.
with.
Those 2 cases that were dismissed, State versus Rousseau and State versus Jessup, not only were those cases dismissed, in both cases, they found that the prosecutor's office had violated the Brady instruction about disclosing exculpatory evidence to the defense and refusal to provide evidence that should be discoverable to the defense. And one of those pieces of evidence was the defendant's phones for in FBI custody and the federal search warrant that my agents wouldn't swear out. There is an affidavit in state court from the state prosecutor given to the judge where the city attorney attests that he had numerous conversations with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that the assistant U.S. attorney flatly refused his state court order. Under no circumstances short of a federal court order will I give you this search warrant or the affidavit. Yet the federal case was going nowhere. There was nothing. There were no subsequent search warrants. There was no federal prosecution. They were simply hiding a bad warrant. And how far were they willing to go? They're willing to take the misdemeanor cases against this in the city. And it's just, there's the term that cover up is worse than the crime. It is in this case. It is obviously awful that they forced through a bad warrant, but then what they've gone through in punishing me, punishing my agents to cover it up, and then refusing to cooperate with a district court in Idaho to produce evidence under court order is, for those of us that have worked in the criminal justice system, that is mind-blowing stuff. Mind-blowing. Cuts to the very core of the concept of our judicial.
And not to mention the unsung heroes, and that's your family, how that's negatively impacted them, your livelihood, your benefits, your retirement. We're not getting younger, we're getting older. Thankfully, you had a business that you were able to go into. It might have been your plans, but I got one more question for you just before we finish up. We talked about this at the beginning. Given the opportunity, would you return to the FBI?
The short answer is yes, but there's a really big but, B-U-T, and a bunch of periods that come after that. I still care deeply about a concept of service, and I care deeply about my friends that are still in the FBI, and I think that the FBI leadership culture is a disgrace to them and a disgrace to the American people. Under the right set of circumstances, with the right request to come in and do something about that, and some amount of accommodation for me and my family and what we've been through, I wouldn't necessarily say no. Obviously, it sucks to have lost the lion's share of my family's income. It sucks to have lost the ability to retire with a pension. At 50, fortunately, I had VA health insurance that I could fall back on too, so we didn't lose it all. But my wife and kids had to go get private insurance. You learn some of the things that are important to you in life. My friends that quietly stood there, voted for me to be their age association rep, or just would answer the phone anytime I called them because I needed a friend to listen to me. They still deserve my support, even if there are parts of me that would just as soon flush the bureaucracy down the toilet. I still believe in the mission of the FBI and the DEA. And if there was ways that I could constructively work to support that in a positive direction and not harm my family in the process, yeah, I'd go back to the Bureau. But whether or not a Cash Patel or a Pam Bondi wants me to be a part of that, because there's so many other people that are out there, I have no idea. We'll find out over time, Murph, and
Do you have any appeals pending?
Oh, yeah. I've put all the whistleblower appeals or in OARM. I've filed appeals to EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And all are on the cusp of me potentially taking them into federal court. But let's be honest, that's going to cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight that fight. And you never know definitively that you're going to win. I would probably win, but I would rather have a political end to that as opposed to spending years in court and wasting taxpayer money and my own money to get to that end. But I'm still unwilling to step out of the breach, and I'm still standing here with this bat.
Good man. Brother, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story. I know you've done it on a few other podcasts, being so transparent about what happened to you and the reasons why. I think they're all very honorable. It's not always easy to stand up and do the right thing. It's always easy just to go along. But when you do that, that violates every oath we've ever taken. That violates the spirit of the law. And that violates what we represent. So in my opinion, you stayed on the right side of that thin blue line. Shame on all those pricks up in Washington, whether it's DOJ, FBI, whoever else had any say-so in this, the people that don't have the stones to stand up and do the right thing, there's absolutely no respect. You don't represent us. You shouldn't be in our law enforcement culture. You're not one of the heroes that we talk about. In my book, Zach, you're a hero because you stood up for what you believed in, brother. So I hate to leave it on such a down note, but I'm proud of you for what you did and doing the right thing.
Will you allow me to, can we end this with a funny story?
Absolutely.
Let's bring this back up. All right, so we're going to rewind the clock from before the train coming off the tracks. I'll share a funny story with you that my DEA brethren and I joke about most every time we get together. All right. As a group, so I was a SWAT agent. I had generally more training than most of my task force officers, but we all did great work, and we would go out and we did warrants a lot. We did far more warrants with my DEA group than I did with the SWAT team. Well, we went out on a drug warrant, 6 a.m. one morning, still pretty aggressive tactics back then. And it was a typical little drug house where you can picture this, Murph. It's just a couple of wooden steps up to a very small, shaky wood landing with a door that's probably been breached by law enforcement multiple times over the last decade. Well, I was number one in the stack. I offset off the door, off the steps, and I'm holding the angle on the opening of the door. And my good friend Tom is number 2 with the ram. And we get the knock and announce. Nobody comes to the door. And the order from the team leader, whoever it was at that point, comes out, breach, and he starts swinging that big ram. Well, you probably recall that after about the 3rd swing, if that door's not open, each subsequent swing is getting weaker and weaker and weaker.
Yeah.
Well, Tom swings once, no opens. Tom swings twice, no open. And at this point, the bull's coming out, and Tom's just swinging like a madman, trying to get that door open. Well, at the 3rd swing, 4th swing, and then I start yelling at Tom, switch out. Tom, switch out. And he won't. He's just seeing red. The bull's seeing red. He won't switch out. He's just hammering on that door for everything he's worth. And finally, I yelled, pick up, and the guy that was next to me with his M4 picked up my cover. I swung my weapon. I came up the stairs, and as Tom was coming back with his swing, I grabbed the ram from him, instinctively just let go of it. I stepped in, took the slack out of the door, and crushed the door and opened wide up. And as you can imagine, Tom is one of the greatest human beings I've ever known. And only a really good human being could handle that and still joke about it today. So to leave your audience on a more fun note, nobody got hurt except for the door and Tom's ego. We got the door open. You know, we searched the place. We got our drugs. Somebody probably went to jail and then probably on to prison. But the bull came out of my good friend, and he was unwilling to give up his war against the door. And unfortunately, FB1 had to come in and take it away from him.
Was it a DEA warrant?
It was either DEA or state police. It was probably for that one in that town where things were going pretty fast. It was probably a state warrant coming off of one of the state police narcotics teams or narcotics groups.
That's fantastic.
So, which is funny because I never saw another instance where Tom would open a door with that big can opener, but in that instance,
that afternoon he was back in the gym pumping the iron. Never going to happen again.
Maybe.
All right,
Soul
Zach.
crushed.
Brother, thank you so much for coming on the show. For all our listeners, you know, it's like I always tell you, don't accept what we tell you as the truth. No matter what it is, always do your own research, and you come to your own decision what's right and wrong. Especially don't let the media tell you what to think. Just tell me the news. I'm smart enough I can figure out what I believe is right and wrong, and I'm asking you to do the same thing here. I'm telling you, this man and his family have suffered for doing the right thing, and unfortunately that happens way, way too often. The weaponization of politics seems that's one of the latest trend phrases that's out there, but let's hope that kind of bullshit stops so that you can have dedicated personnel like Zach and all his colleagues that are willing to risk their life to protect all of us. None of it's right, but thank you for coming back to the show every week. We've got another great guest coming next week. I'm not going to tell you who it is right now, mainly because I don't know. I might, but I'm not going to tell you. You know what we say here. Thank you for coming back every week to play the biggest, baddest, most dangerous game of all, and that's the game of crimes. I'll see y'all next week. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Murph.